The last 2 weeks have been, without exaggeration, some of the finest gaming I can remember having in years. Crimson Desert is the real thing. A game that earns every syllable of the word adventure in a way the genre has largely stopped attempting. Where the action is genuinely actioned and the world is genuinely worlded. Where the scale isn't performed, but felt. Where 150 hours in, I am somehow still sitting at Chapter 6, with the distinct and not unpleasant suspicion that I have seen perhaps a tenth of what's actually there. I have an enormous amount to say about the experience itself, the way the adventure is architected, so that nothing overwhelms you, so that the world withholds its secrets with the patience of something that knows you'll come looking, rather than depositing them in your path like a trail of breadcrumbs. But that's a different essay for a different day. And if you've been anywhere near TikTok or X or Instagram recently, you already understand what I mean. Because every other scroll surfaces another piece of gear, another hidden mechanic, another secret sequence that sends you back into Pywell with the specific urgency of someone who has just been told about a room in their own house they didn't know existed. It is, in the most genuinely complimentary sense, a game engineered for the social media age. Not through spectacle or vanity bait, but through the sheer, inexhaustible density of things worth finding. But that is not what today is about. Today is about something I think matters considerably more than my experience of it. Something hiding in plain sight behind all the discourse and the review drama and the journalist class retreating behind the impenetrable shield of "it's just my opinion" whenever the accountability conversation gets too close for comfort. We have written extensively on that institution, on the weaponization of critical opinion as a mechanism for influence without responsibility, on the echo chamber that has learned to deploy the language of subjectivity as a defense against standards. And we won't relitigate that ground here. What Crimson Desert has revealed that feels more urgently worth examining, more structurally damning than any individual review score, is something that sits underneath all of it and implicates the entire Western AAA development model in a way that no amount of critical consensus can manage or obscure. It's the cost. Crimson Desert was built for $133 million across 7 years. Hold that number while the comparison assembles itself, because the assembly is where the indictment lives. Concord, Sony's flagship live service bet, 8 years in development, consumed over $200 million, generated losses of equivalent scale, was deleted from existence 12 days after launch, and resulted in the complete closure of Firewalk Studios and the termination of roughly 210 people who had spent years of their lives building it. The people who greenlit it kept their positions. The people who built it lost their jobs. And Sony, the same Sony that presided over this, has since raised the price of its hardware multiple times, citing global economic pressures, which may be entirely true and entirely beside the point simultaneously, because a company with this quality of capital allocation judgment is now asking its audience to pay more for the privilege of funding whatever comes next. Skull and Bones consumed hundreds of millions. Some estimates place it north of $500 million across a full decade of development, multiple reboots, and scope changes so extreme and so prolonged that the product which eventually shipped felt less like a finished game and more like the institutional memory of one, a ghost of ambition that had been restarted so many times that nobody involved could remember what it was originally supposed to be. Ubisoft now finds itself in full restructuring mode, slashing projects and staff just to remain viable, which is what a decade of this quality of decision-making eventually produces. Dragon Age Veilguard, Suicide Squad killed the Justice League, each absorbing roughly double Crimson Desert's entire budget, each arriving and departing without leaving a recoverable mark on anything. The specific texture of each failure has stopped being interesting because the pattern beneath them has become too consistent to require individual diagnosis. And this has been the reality of Western AAA for the better part of a decade now. A sustained, compounding pattern of studios spending more and delivering less, of players returning to each release hoping this is the one that remembers what games are supposed to feel like, only to watch another bloated, committee-designed, compliance-optimized product arrive, underperform, and disappear within months. That accumulated disappointment is not abstract. It is a vacuum. The specific, palpable absence of the kind of game that made people fall in love with the medium in the first place. A gap that has been widening for years, while the establishment congratulated itself on its own sophistication. And it is precisely into that vacuum, into that accumulated hunger for something that simply respects the person holding the controller, that the challengers have arrived. Pearl Abyss from Seoul with Crimson Desert, Game Science from Shenzhen with Black Myth Wukong. Studios operating from countries that the Western press spent years treating as peripheral to the conversation about where the future of the medium was being built. Economies that arrived at technological and creative maturity without inheriting the accumulated institutional weight of their Western counterparts, unburdened by the decades of regulatory sediment, compliance architecture, and ideological overhead that mature Western corporate culture has layered so thoroughly into its operating costs that it no longer recognizes them as choices, and who have now, in the space of a single console generation, produced two of the most commercially and culturally significant releases the industry has seen in years. Both of them built leaner, faster, and with a directness of creative intent that the incumbent order has structurally lost the capacity to replicate. The threat this poses is not rhetorical. It is existential. Because what these studios have demonstrated, at commercial scale, in public, with the receipts fully visible, is that the overhead the Western establishment has naturalized as the unavoidable cost of serious game development is not a feature of serious game development at all. It is a feature of the institutional machinery that has grown up around serious game development. And that machinery, it turns out, is optional. To understand precisely how expensive that institutional machinery has become, and why studios operating outside it have such a profound and compounding structural advantage, you have to look at the numbers the industry never discusses in this context, because discussing them honestly would require implicating the entire economic and cultural environment that Western AAA has built its cost structure around. Federal regulatory compliance costs American businesses $2.1 trillion annually. Not in taxes, not in wages, in the pure administrative overhead of existing as a large employer inside an increasingly complex legal environment. The lawyers, the documentation, the reporting requirements, the institutional machinery whose sole organizational purpose is managing the consequences of operating under compounding legal obligation. The Competitive Enterprise Institute's most recent analysis puts this figure at 7% of GDP, translating to $16,000 per American household per year in costs so thoroughly embedded in the price of every product and service that they never appear on any receipt, but are paid nonetheless, invisibly, by everyone. The average American firm now devotes between 1.3 and 3.3% of its entire wage bill, not to building anything, not to creating anything a customer will ever encounter, but exclusively to regulatory compliance, to people whose professional function is managing the paperwork generated by other people managing paperwork, in a recursive bureaucratic loop that compounds automatically as the organization grows too large and too comfortable to interrogate whether any of it serves the product. This is the water Western AAA studios swim in before a single enemy is designed, before a single frame of combat animation is iterated to the point of physical satisfaction, before the compliance spend even begins. Because layered on top of this structural regulatory overhead sits something more specific, more culturally particular, and considerably more expensive in ways that almost nobody with a platform in this industry has the institutional incentive to quantify honestly. Look at what happened to Target. In early 2025, facing political pressure, Target rolled back its DEI programs, and the commercial consequences were immediate, documented, and genuinely instructive for anyone trying to understand why large Western institutions make the creative and financial decisions they make. Foot traffic dropped 9.5% in the first full month of boycotts. The stock price collapsed from $142 to $94, erasing $12.4 billion in market value in weeks. Comparable sales fell 3.8% in the first quarter, with the CEO explicitly citing the DEI backlash in the earnings call as a contributing factor, warning that the decline would extend across the full year. $12.4 billion. Not because Target's products got worse, not because their stores changed, because the company adjusted its ideological compliance infrastructure and the market responded to the political and reputational exposure that adjustment created. Now understand what that lesson teaches every major corporate, legal, and communications team operating in the same cultural environment, which includes every major Western AAA studio headquartered in California or Canada or Western Europe. The lesson is that ideological compliance infrastructure is not merely a cost center. It is institutional insurance, the mechanism by which an organization protects itself from the precise category of reputational and financial risk that Target experienced in real time, in public, with $12 billion of consequences attached. Which means that for every studio retaining sensitivity consultants at six-figure rates per project, the calculation being made is not primarily a creative one, or even a values one. It is a risk management one. The compliance spend is cheaper than the alternative, cheaper than the shareholder lawsuit, cheaper than the boycott campaign, cheaper than the market cap erosion. And because the Metacritic bonus structure simultaneously rewards the kind of safe, reviewer-friendly, ideologically legible output that this compliance environment tends to produce, the system creates a closed loop of perfect institutional rationality. Spend on compliance, produce something safe, hit the threshold, collect the bonus, avoid the exposure. Publishers have a documented history. The EA and Obsidian cases are public record, of writing specific score thresholds directly into developer compensation agreements, which means the creative decision-making of an entire medium has been formally subordinated to the aesthetic preferences of a relatively small population of professional critics whose own institutional interests are entangled with the financial health of the publishers they cover. Every act of creative risk-taking that might have produced something genuinely surprising becomes a quantifiable threat to individual financial security at every level of the organization simultaneously. The junior developers who absorbed this lesson and adjusted their creative instincts accordingly, the mid-level leads who stopped advocating for proposals they understood would be quietly filed away, the designers who identified structural failure 8 months before launch and lacked the organizational standing to escalate it to anyone positioned to act. Those are the people who receive the termination letters when the product collapses. The executives who commissioned the spend restructure their messaging and begin the next cycle. The critics whose aggregated preferences shaped the bonus structures that governed every meaningful creative decision move on to the next preview event. The distribution of consequence is not incidental to the system. It is what allows the system to persist. Pearl Abyss operates outside this loop entirely, and so does Game Science, the studio behind Black Myth Wukong, operating out of China on conviction, at a fraction of these budgets, without a sensitivity consultant or a Metacritic threshold clause, or a floor of compliance infrastructure consuming the development budget before a single asset reached the screen, producing one of the most culturally resonant action games in years, breaking Steam concurrent records, and demonstrating that the pattern is not Korean or Chinese or Eastern in any reductive geographic sense, but structural. It is what happens when capital reaches the product rather than the institution surrounding the product. When the people making creative decisions have genuine skin in the outcome, rather than a compliance framework protecting them from its consequences. Not because the regulatory environments of Seoul or Shanghai are without complexity, but because the specific configuration of legal, ideological, and institutional overhead that has become structurally load-bearing in Western AAA development does not exist there at the same scale or with the same compounding weight. The capital that in a major Western studio flows into compliance architecture, sensitivity review, legal protection, and the recursive HR infrastructure that sustains all of it, flows at Pearl Abyss and Game Science toward the screen, toward the combat system, toward the world density, toward the 150 hours of content that has players still in the first region 2 weeks post-launch. The counter-argument that surfaces whenever Korean or Chinese development efficiency enters this conversation, that lower costs reflect exploitation rather than efficiency, collapses the moment it engages with purchasing power parity rather than nominal compensation figures. A developer at Pearl Abyss or Game Science, drawing a salary that reads as modest against San Francisco market rates, inhabits a city where housing, food, and transport operate on a fundamentally different cost basis, where the real purchasing power of that compensation, measured against what it actually constructs in terms of material quality of life, closes the gap considerably, and in many cases, inverts it entirely relative to counterparts navigating the compounding cost of living catastrophe in Los Angeles or the Bay Area, when nominal salaries have long since decoupled from any livable relationship with actual expenses. The exploitation framing is not just analytically incorrect. It is a rhetorical maneuver that redirects attention away from the structural sources of the efficiency gap and toward a moral argument whose primary function is to make the people advancing it feel better about the system they are defending. The thesis was never geographic. The thesis is that hunger beats comfort with the consistency and structural inevitability of a physical law, that a studio operating with genuine conviction, with nothing institutional to protect and everything reputational to prove, will systematically outperform a studio that has been profitable long enough to metabolize its own survival as a form of success. The Western evidence makes this unavoidable. Larian made Baldur's Gate 3 with the creative conviction the established publishers had retired years before its greenlight. Expedition 33 assembled on a budget EA would classify as a rounding error and occupies the Game of the Year conversation on player enthusiasm alone, the kind that cannot be manufactured through Metacritic engineering, because it is specifically the product of making something people wanted rather than something the system rewarded. CDPR built The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077 out of Warsaw, without the infrastructure, without the institutional safety net, with everything to prove. 2 decade-defining open-world RPGs, representing the last time the Western tradition of the genre operated a genuine creative altitude. When did Blizzard last operate from that position? Overwatch was over a decade ago, mechanically focused and impressive in execution, but modest in scope. When was the last genuinely great RPG from an established Western publisher? Skyrim, which now runs its own nostalgia cycle for players who weren't alive when it launched. The talent did not go anywhere. The hunger did. Japan tells its own version of this, once the industry's most reliable source of formal invention and genuine creative strangeness, now operating with its own franchise protection logic, its own preservation-oriented risk calculus, its own institutional timidity accumulated across decades of commercial success. The genuine challenges in 2026 are concentrating in Seoul and Shanghai and Beijing, in studios that haven't accumulated enough comfort to stop swinging, whose creative decisions are still being made by people with something materially at stake in the outcome, who cannot afford the compliance loop because they never built the institutional machinery that that makes the compliance loop feel necessary in the first place. This is the correction the market has been building pressure toward for years, and it is now releasing in ways the establishment cannot redirect or absorb. And for the players watching this, that is unambiguously good news. The players who watched development budgets compound toward figures that no longer have any intuitive relationship to the products they were supposed to fund, who sat through the managed consensus and the engineered critical vocabulary and the Metacritic architecture, and simply wanted someone to build something worth finishing, are the direct beneficiaries of a competitive landscape in which lean and hungry is systematically dismantling fat and comfortable on the only scoreboard that was ever epistemically honest. More ambition, more systemic depth, more worlds dense enough that 150 hours in, you still suspect you've seen a tenth of what's there. Built by studios that remember the only opinion that was ever worth optimizing for belongs to the person holding the controller. The future of this industry doesn't belong to the comfortable. It belongs to the hungry. And the hungry, from Seoul, from Shanghai, from Beijing, from Warsaw, from wherever conviction hasn't yet been institutionalized into compliance, are already here. As always, thanks for watching, and for all the likes, subs, comments, and memberships. It genuinely means a lot. Everything else is down in the description. Until next time, peace.